Member Fong Lim.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Good to see you.
First homeowners grants have a long and complex history in Australia. It's useful to look at what has been done historically to give context to what this government is seeking to do and indeed what it is not seeking to do. There has already been a great deal of misunderstanding of the scheme that we are putting forward, as is evident from some of the contributions made by members on the other side. And so indulge me while we work through what this scheme is about and not about. First homeowners grants started in 1964 under the Menzies government. And at that time, it was the home savings grants of up to $500 for married and engaged couples under 36. And it was a co-contribution scheme. It was about $1 for every $3 that you had saved in an approved form in the 3 years prior to purchasing a home, with a $14,000 cap on the home. Whitlam abolished that scheme in 1973 in favour of a tax deduction of interest for anyone earning less than $14,000. The scheme then was reintroduced in 1976 by the Fraser government, but without a price cap, without an age cap or the marriage requirements, and expanded to $2,500. That was then again replaced after a long stint by the Hawke government as the first homeowners grants assistance scheme, with a maximum of $7,000 this time, but income tested. And that reform was implemented by the then Federal Treasurer Paul Keating, who then, in 1990, scrapped the scheme. It was abolished and it stayed so for another decade. A decade later, the Howard government introduced the first home owners grants, which is perhaps no surprise because John Howard, when he was a young solicitor, was the person who advised the Fraser government and lobbied in the first instance for the introduction of stimulus in this space. And that was a maximum, there was no income test, in fact, or cap on that scheme, and it proved to be successful relative to some of its peers based on the yardstick used to measure it. In 2008, the Rudd government then continued the scheme but rebranded it as the first homeowners boost. And the reason they did it was the time of the global financial crisis. And what they did was expand the system to boost construction at a time when construction was depressed, as was consumer demand. And so you went from having a $7,000 scheme that had been around for a long time to 7 plus 7, so $14,000 now for existing homes. And the new and novel part was adding another 7 if you were to build a new home, so $21,000. Now, if you include all state and territory schemes, the member for Nightcliff, in fact, has been generous in suggesting that all of the schemes over the history of time have cost some $20 billion. It's probably closer to a $25 billion outlay, I would say, over history. The question really is here, why am I raising this history beyond just the dumb facts and figures? Because it's obvious that the systems have chopped and changed, and there's no straightforward pattern here where it's a Labor government program or a Liberal government program. The reason I raise this history is because different times and different conditions warranted different economic responses. And they also produced different results throughout different times. It is, once again, lazy, as has become the order of things in this House, to assume that everything we do is cookie cutter, to assume that all first homeowners grants schemes have been the same or indeed will produce the same results. So what then is our renty situation? Why are we looking into this situation at the moment? Okay, first of all, there is a rental crisis across the country and everyone agrees. Relative to other jurisdictions, though, there is more headroom in the rental market here than there is anywhere else in the country. A buoyant rental market might have 3% headroom. Other states and territories have had less than 1%, some of them, for a period of time, and it is seriously nigh on impossible to try and rent somewhere. Now, our market is smaller and fluctuates, but we've been hovering above 1% still. So we do have people that are trapped in a cycle of not being able to own and have been renting. And what we're trying to do in the first instance is also help some of those people out of the rental cycle, knowing that people who buy are more likely to stay put. The second part is on the absence of supply. And indeed, even Saul Eslake, who I'm glad the member for Nightcliff referenced, who is one of the most vociferous critics of first homeowners grants and has been for years and years and years and years and years, will tell you that if you are going to do something in this space, stimulate supply. If you're going to do something in this space, do what you can to stimulate supply. And I was reading a submission that Saul Eslake wrote. It's 10 years old now, so it's slightly out of date. But again, it was to a Senate Economics Reference Committee into affordable housing, and he does lambast first homeowners grants over a period of time that have been targeted specifically at creating affordable housing. That is not what we are seeking to do here. We appreciate there's an issue there, but read the details. Read the explanatory memorandum. Read the second reading speech. And due credit to the member for Nightcliff, at least she's done some homework. The Leader of the Opposition failed to do any, as far as I can tell, and isn't even here to be lectured by me. The fact of the matter is,
Point of order,
our...
Deputy Speaker.
Yes.
The member referred to a member being out. So you can't actually refer to a member being outside the chamber. I ask that he withdraws that comment.
Point taken.
He needs to withdraw the comment, Deputy Speaker.
I withdraw the statement.
Thank you very much, Member Fong Lim.
The key here is that my learned colleague, the Treasurer, articulated the parameters of this scheme very clearly, and we have had a month to process those details in the explanatory statement, in the second reading speech, and there are no caps on the purchase or build price of the home, no caps on the income of applicants. It is a time-limited scheme for 12 months. It actually provides the best possible chances of allowing people to capitalise on a stimulus project. In any case, returning to what then is our NT situation. So one, we have a rental market that is bad, but not as bad as it could be elsewhere, but we're trying to do something about it with this scheme by incentivising people being able to move into purchase. Two, there is an absence of supply, and even the most ardent critics of first homeowners grant schemes will say if you're going to do something in this space, then do something to stimulate supply. Three, and I turn to the Rudd government's efforts now in and around the global financial crisis, we have a sluggish construction industry in the Northern Territory now because consumer, retail, investor, unit confidence are all down. And so what we're seeking to do here is to stimulate that sector by providing them with the incentive to build, with the incentive to put skin in the game. And it is a generous scheme, and we are a generous government in that regard, but we are advisedly taking a calculated risk to generate stimulus, and that is why it is a generous scheme. But perhaps the most important factor in understanding what our NT situation is currently is appreciating where our population is at. And I have spoken about this ad nauseum in this House, but our population and our growth is at an all-time low. We are in a state of demographic decline. We have 250,000 people and we are declining in real terms, and it's because of the failure to provide the economic preconditions to allow people to succeed here over a long period of time. And much of what we discuss in this House is the downstream consequence of the poor economic choices that have been made by governments over a decade and perhaps longer. Now, what we're trying to do here is appreciate our specific situation: rentals, stimulating supply, sluggish construction, low population. And in the context of all of those factors, it makes a lot of sense to think about what we might do to mitigate our demographic decline and our faltering economy, utilising a mechanism that we know will have a material impact if we can keep some people from leaving. Where might those people go? Well, one of the places that is on the cards and extremely important to me is Berrima Northcrest. Berrima Northcrest is a faltering development, not because of any fault of the population there, but because growth in that precinct has stagnated. And growth in that precinct, again, has stagnated on the basis of a lack of economic policy stimulus. What Berrima Northcrest needs right now is a bus service. What Berrima Northcrest needs is shops. What Berrima Northcrest needs is a postal service. What Berrima Northcrest needs are schools on the horizon. And what Berrima Northcrest is going to get is absolutely none of that unless we build more houses out there. And that is why we are seeking to stimulate supply. Now, it's not going to happen overnight. And the government is trying to be sensible in terms of weighing its risk by making sure that this is not an infinite program, it's a time-limited program. Over 12 months now, we're trying to stimulate the construction sector and supply. Is there the possibility of overheating the market? Of course there is. Anytime you inject a new input into the system, that's a possibility. But at the same time, we can see that there is activity being generated. There is a large amount of interest in this scheme. All of you across your electorates will be aware of the number of people who have been saying, I'm really interested in the uptake of this. Now, we're hoping that the interest will translate into uptake, but the signs are promising. And one of the reasons the signs are so promising is because, again, there is a misunderstanding about who is eligible for our scheme and why they are eligible. Permanent residents, as well as citizens, are eligible for our scheme. And that is a good thing, not a bad thing, contrary to some of what is being insinuated from across the other side. We aren't the first jurisdiction to allow permanent residents to access first homeowners grants, but we are offering the most generous ones, and we are the first one to be in this dire straits when it comes to population growth. By offering the opportunity to put down roots, we are opening up new, significant possibilities for permanent residents. And who are those permanent residents, statistically speaking, who might not yet have become citizens? They are the young and aspirational families. They are the people who came here to study and have tried to make a go of it in this place and perhaps are not doing as well in the labour market as they would like to be because conditions have been economically depressed. Those are the people now we're saying, hang on, don't go down to Sydney or Melbourne, hold your horses. Here's a reason to stick around. If you can scratch together your end, we will offer you a generous grant to put down roots, to build a house, and then to make a real go of it. So the fact that we are offering this grant to permanent residents and that they are so generous is not cavalier, it's not trotting out a system that hasn't worked elsewhere. It's a specific policy response to our conditions. To the point that was raised before about assisting Territorians, well, here's a tip. Those permanent residents are Territorians. They are all Territorians. They're the kind of Territorians that we're trying to incentivise to stick around. Now, I addressed this House on the 24th of October on the topic of demographic decline and spelt out some of the nuts and bolts of where our situation is at present. The reason, the fundamental reason that I am in support of this bill is because unless we do something to mitigate negative net interstate migration, we will not have the workforce or the population to support any of our aspirations in any industry. Now, this bill provides the preconditions and the incentives to try and mitigate some of that net interstate migration. We're talking about permanent residents who've transitioned from temporary visas to permanent visas, who are now looking to put down roots somewhere, who have been struggling in this marketplace and might be thinking about going to a bigger one. And this is an excellent idea to try and tempt them to not pack up. Now, it's not just my opinion. I have a professional opinion in this area. But the fact is, again, the academic evidence is on our side in this regard. and it suggests a strong correlation between housing availability and population retention. There are a couple of things that I dug up, and I think the reason they're worth speaking about here is because that they are produced by local researchers. They're not about random places, far-flung jurisdictions, disconnected to our reality. There's a couple of very recent papers here, produced by people who are all based at the Northern Institute at Charles Darwin University, who are studying our polity and providing us with the best information that they can to help guide our decision-making. One of those pieces of work is by Derting, Taylor and Shalley from 2020. It's a paper entitled A Life Stage Approach for Understanding Population Retention in Sparsely Populated Areas in the Journal of Rural Studies. And that's specifically what we are, a sparsely populated area at this point, which we're trying to turn around. And I would encourage you all, once again, to track down these resources because they're wildly instructive. But just from the abstract of the paper, those authors make the observation that their results highlight the importance of overseas-born residents for their high retention rates across all life stages, home ownership, and having children resident in the Northern Territory. That's not a piece of research about Timbuktu, that's a piece of research about the Northern Territory. A second one worth looking at is Bagan et al. From 2023. And the paper is entitled The Application of Machine Learning to Rural Population Migrations Research. It's a really novel and interesting piece of work, and I might point out published in a journal that I have never once managed to get published and been rejected from about 100 times, Population, Space and Place, a very serious journal. And it really does point to the importance in factors using Spearman correlations of what matters in people choosing to stick around and go. And one of the things they test is housing affordability and I believe also housing availability, alongside other factors like Darwin's unique lifestyle and opportunities and cost of living and infrastructure and so on and so forth. The key point again is that if you're going to have a crack at it, then, look at the research. We're not just shooting from the hip and coming up with ideas on the basis of, well, that worked once before somewhere else or it's something we could do. It's a specific, considered policy response to the situation we are facing in the Northern Territory. If you don't have the stomach for academic research, which I appreciate not everyone does, an excellent piece of work that I think everybody should look at in this House, produced by the Australian Housing Urban Research Institute, is entitled Financing First Home Ownership, Opportunities and Challenges. It's a final report that Ahuri did. Ahuri advises governments across the country as an independent think tank on all matters housing related. And Ahuri will be, referred to by other academic entities. On page 31 of that report that I've just cited, the Ahuri final report notes the following, and I quote, "Government-instigated supply-side measures to promote home ownership were instrumental in supporting post-war growth of owner-occupation and have since become far less common. Some innovative schemes have been initiated, though in general they remain relatively small scale and are generally targeted at specific groups with bespoke needs." Unquote. Ours is a novel and generous scheme at a time when fewer of them exist, at a time when it is worth taking a chance on economically, at a time when we are in a state of terminal demographic decline, at a time where we do not have the capacity to broker new migration arrangements with the Commonwealth Government, having demonstrated nothing but fiscal negligence for 8 years. We are doing what we can on this side of the House to demonstrate to the marketplace, to the media, to the public, that grown-ups are in charge of the economy. And we are spending money prudently to try and invigorate the economy in the right places. So what then is the intention of our homegrown territory grants? Well, it's very clear, and as I said, if you had referred to any of the explanatory materials, it would be clear to you as well. Our grants are designed to assist people to get out of the rental cycle and into home ownership, to increase the supply of new dwellings, and to stimulate residential construction industry and retain population by encouraging people to put down roots in the territory. I applaud the courage of the Chief Minister and this government in being bold on these matters. The truth is that there has been risk-averse policy making in this place on a range of issues, social and economic, for a long period of time. And the lack of imagination, the lack of courage, the failure to consult the data, and inability to treat this place with the reverence it deserves. We are a place of lawmaking, of decision-making for the citizenry of the entire Northern Territory, is what has gotten us to the place that we're at. I specifically applaud the courage of the Chief Minister in this regard, noting the contrast with her predecessor and her immediate predecessor, and the former government's total unwillingness to face economic reality and or demographic decline. And I say that not just as a bit of theatrics, I say that from my own personal, learned, lived professional experience. My previous guise was as a public servant, trying to help the government of the day with population growth, migration and talent acquisition. And I can attest to the former government's willful blindness on our demographic decline, their inability to understand that you must stimulate residential construction and you must create houses and you must broker your arrangements with the Commonwealth on migration if you don't want the Northern Territory to demographically collapse and economically collapse. So on that basis, I'm extremely grateful for the courage of the Chief Minister and this government in being willing to offer a generous scheme. Is risk attached to the scheme? Of course risk is attached to the scheme. But have we considered that risk? Yes. And that is why we are all united in pushing for this scheme. Now, it's early days, but there is an encouraging amount of interest in the scheme across all the categories of homegrown. As has been documented but is worth reiterating, the Homegrown Territory Program provides first home buyers with grants of $50,000 to build or purchase a new home or $10,000 to purchase an established home. And the bill we are debating today makes legislative amendments to the 2000 Act to put into effect those measures. But additional to that, by administrative workaround, we also have the Fresh Start program providing grants of $30,000 for non-first home buyers who have already owned property to construct or purchase a new home. Again, the aspiration here is to stimulate supply and growth. Our hope, of course, is that by the 30th of September next year, the considerable interest that we have seen in the scheme will translate to commensurate uptake and the purchase and or building of new dwellings. Now, in the first instance, given that we've only just announced the scheme and we are in the midst of the legislation, you wouldn't expect for there to have been massive uptake of the construction of new houses. You would expect that the most movement would be in relation to transfers on existing properties. And so that is the case. But again, there's encouraging movement in that space, and those are movements for first home buyers, and we are creating headroom in the market, and we are stimulating supply in modest but important ways. My area of professional expertise is not as an economist, but as a migration specialist, as a population specialist. And so I'm comfortable in being able to say, it is my belief that a small difference to our net negative interstate migration situation, a small improvement in that space would have the capacity to have a disproportionately large and positive impact in a place with an economy of our size. And so this is a worthwhile bet. If the numbers that were alluded to by previous speakers manifest, and we are able to create hundreds and hundreds of new houses, there will be an enormous effect. But even if the numbers are relatively modest, this won't be a policy failure. This will be a policy success. It will have been a mitigation strategy to stop people who are otherwise going to leave from leaving. It will compel them to stay. It will compel them to put their kids into schools there. It will compel them to reinvest in our economy. It will help consumer demand. We need people in the Northern Territory. And look, there are lots of ways to try and attract people to the Northern Territory, and this is just one of them. More will be on their way, but for present purposes, I agree with my learned colleague, the Treasurer, when he suggests that enabling more people to enter the housing market increases the likelihood of them staying in the Territory. And on the basis of that assertion, I am pleased to commend this bill to the House.